Hello, my name is Charles Bedord. Have you ever wondered what it takes to get a vial of medication such as this? From being just a good scientific idea to being on your pharmacist's shelf? Well, if so, please stay tuned to the better part while we discuss pharmaceutical development from lab bench to bedside.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program by and for seniors and devoted to exploring the many facets of those better years of our lives. The name of our program was inspired by a quotation from Robert Browning. Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first was made. Now, sit back and enjoy a program made especially to provide seniors with useful information, plus some lighter moments to brighten your day.
Hello, my name is Charles Bedord, and welcome to The Better Part. Our guest today is Dr. Raj Mohibir. Raj is site head for Pharmaceutical Development Project Management at Roche in Palo Alto, one of 4 global sites for research and development at Roche. Prior to Roche, Raj has held positions at Amgen, Genentech, and Syntex. Raj received a bachelor's degree in microbiology and immunology from McGill University in Canada, a PhD from Dalhousie University in Canada, and completed postdoctoral training in cardiovascular medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Raj has been an active speaker at various meetings and congresses on project management and drug development over the past 12 years. Raj, welcome to The Better Part.
Thank you, Charles.
Raj, when people in industry talk about pharmaceutical development, they'll typically divide it into about 4 stages: preclinical, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about what happens in each of these stages. And let's start with the first one at preclinical.
So, Charles, first of all, in the preclinical phase, and when I use that term preclinical, it means before a drug gets into human beings. When I say clinical, it means that that's when we put it into humans. So at the preclinical phase, we are trying to determine whether a drug has the potential to be safe and to work in humans. So just at that point, the first thing we need to decide is, should we develop a drug? And so in my experience and from the companies I've worked for, the main thing we're looking for is to find drugs to cure diseases where there are unmet medical needs. In other words, these are serious diseases such as cancer or cardiovascular disease.
So these are not necessarily Me Too products where you're developing drugs that are just as effective as what's out there in the market. These are really cutting-edge drugs to treat unmet medical needs then.
That's exactly right. So there has to be a need out there. We're trying to find cure for very serious diseases. So at this preclinical phase, before we get into humans, we take a look at a drug and we say, is it going to work? It has a potential to work. And there are ways we have of assessing that. Mm-hmm. And we also have to determine whether it will be safe when we put it into a human being.
Can you give us some examples of the types of studies that may be done to determine potential safety and effectiveness of a new drug?
Yes. So these preclinical studies, for example, and I'll use this as an example, is if we're looking at a drug to have an effect on the heart, say people with congestive heart failure, we have ways of testing these before they get into humans. For example, we can grow heart cells in a dish, a petri dish.
Interesting.
And these cells beat. And what we do is we add the drug and we see what it does to the beating of those cells. And we're able then to determine whether it will work. If it causes erratic behavior in those heart cells, we could say, well, this is probably not a very safe drug.
So how long do these preclinical studies usually last? So what's a typical duration, and what do they cost a company roughly?
Yes. So from the time we've decided that this is a chemical that we want to put into humans, to the time when we put into humans, it will last about, say, 16 months roughly. About
that's a long time. Yes.
To do all of these preclinical studies and to manufacture the drug. And the cost will vary. It could be in the millions, probably, within $10 million.
Right.
considering all of the manpower and all of the studies we need to do.
So it certainly is not a short-term or inexpensive proposition
No,
to
it
start
isn't.
preclinical
It
work.
isn't.
Now, when you have all this preclinical data assembled and you've done the studies, what does it take now to get into humans for the first time? Who do you have to interact with? What type of documents have to be completed? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So here in the United States, we have a government agency, the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And any company that makes a chemical that they want to put into humans as a drug, a potential drug, have to submit this information to the Food and Drug Administration. And the Food and Drug Administration will determine whether or not you are allowed to test this into humans. And the main concern of the Food and Drug Administration is, will this be safe when you put it into a human?
Right. So they're at this stage in early phase 1 studies, they would not be really interested necessarily entirely in efficacy, but they're looking at safety.
Absolutely. Safety is the number one concern. And again, I'll reiterate the fact that this is probably the first time this foreign chemical is being put into a human body.
And about how long does FDA need to review all this preclinical data to make that kind of a determination?
So from the time we submit the information, and this information is contains all of the preclinical studies.
Right.
It contains how we will manufacture the drug, in other words, the recipe, and all of the controls around that recipe. So all of that information we know, we submit to the FDA, and they're given 30 days.
Oh, that's not all that long.
To say yes or no.
Yeah.
And these are sometimes thousands of pages of information.
Right. Okay. Now, as FDA does, for instance, give you an approval to go into humans for the first time, what else has to happen? I've heard that there's things such as institutional review boards, drugs have to be shipped, patients have to be screened. Could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yes. So our first goal when we put this chemical or a drug into humans is we want to determine whether it is safe.
Right.
And we want to understand also how the drug behaves in human beings, how it's broken down. So to do that, we have to do studies, and we do those studies in actually volunteers. These are healthy people. They're not patients with a disease. They're healthy people. And for us to do that, we have to submit what's called a protocol to say what we will do and how we will do it. And we submit that protocol. Not only does the FDA have to approve it, but we send it out to clinics. And these are places where they will be able to do the clinical study to administer the drug, and also to take blood draws, for example, to understand how the drug behaves.
Right.
And so to get approval for that, we have institutional review boards to make sure that you're doing this in an ethical way, a very safe way, and they have to approve that protocol.
Now, these healthy volunteers, who typically are these people, and how are they recruited, and why are they doing this type of thing?
So in most cases, when we're talking about healthy volunteers, we're talking about population, and for example, for women, it's women that are of not childbearing potential.
Oh, yes, yes.
So it's more an older population we are looking at, and people usually volunteer for these type of studies because they're paid for it.
Okay.
We do remunerate people, so they're paid for it, and that's how we do these early studies.
Okay, and these early studies, I understand, are known as phase 1 studies.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, and done primarily for safety, and typically in the phase 1 portion of development, how many studies are usually included during the phase 1 portion?
Yes. So usually 2 types of studies. The first study is what we call a single dose study. So we will take volunteers, and I should say that volunteers, even though they're paid for these studies, they have to sign a consent form, which makes sure that they understand what is the chemical that they're going to be taking, how often blood draws will be taken from them. They understand what the preclinical studies told us about this chemical, and they've agreed to participate in the study. So what happens in the phase 1 study, the first thing we do is we'll just give 1 dose of the drug.
Okay.
And we will monitor the volunteer. And monitor means we will, for example, look at their blood pressure, heart rate. We'll have blood draws to assess how the drug is being broken down and where it disappears from the blood. Once we've determined that that dose is safe, we will take a next set of volunteers and increase the dose.
Okay.
And then we will wait a while after that single dose, and then we'll take the next set of volunteers. So what we're doing is we're understanding how the drug is behaving in the body, and at what dose we start to see some potential side effects. For example, we may see headache or a slight increase in blood pressure. That's when we will stop dosing the drug, and that's when we know that that's the highest level of that dose we can give. So that's one set of studies we do in phase 1.
Okay.
Then we want to know now how the drug will behave when we dose it repeatedly. So we start these studies again, and we, instead of giving one dose, we'll give a number of different doses over a period of time. For example, we gave 2 doses a day for 7 days.
Or multiple doses.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and then we will then increase the dose level and do that again. And so that's what we're doing in phase 1. We're understanding something about how much drug we need to give and what the potential safety issues are and how it behaves in the body.
Okay. Do you typically look for any signs of effectiveness in phase 1? Or?
In general, we don't, but there are some specific instances where we will, in phase 1, not study the drug in normal volunteers, but study the drug in patients with the disease.
And what would be an example of that?
And an example of that, actually, the example of that is in cancer. So in cancer, you know, a very, very debilitating and a very serious disease, where there are really no cures in cancer, what we do is we do not have time, and patients, in a way, do not have time to wait for a drug to get on the market. So in phase 1, we will enroll patients in a study, and these are patients who have cancers who are not responsive to whatever type of therapy they're getting, and so they're, as a last resort, we'll say we're testing out this drug. We do not know if it's going to work, but it's for cancer.
But these are patients then who are not responding well to traditional therapy that's already available in the marketplace.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And talk a little bit about how long does phase 1 typically last for a compound, and what are the costs involved with phase 1?
So phase 1 in normal volunteers, by the time we understand the dose and the safety around this drug, it will probably last about 1.5 years.
Okay.
And be anywhere from about $2 to $10 million.
$2 to $10 million,
yes,
really?
Yes.
Interesting.
Just to conduct a clinical study.
Yes. Okay, and how many patients or say subjects are typically included in a single dose or multiple dose phase 1 study?
So combining it, we're probably looking about anywhere from 10 to about 100 volunteers.
I see. So it can vary quite a bit then.
It can.
Okay, well now after phase 1, we proceed on to phase 2.
Yes.
And how is a decision made to actually proceed to phase 2 rather than just stop development of a drug? Can you tell a little bit about the decision-making process that goes into it? What is phase 2 also?
Okay. So once we understand how the drug behaves in normal humans, normal volunteers, and then what we want to do is then study it in patients with the disease.
Okay.
So for us to make that decision, we look at the information we received in phase 1. Do we understand how the doses, how they increase? Do we understand what are the potential safety issues? Do we understand how the body is breaking down this drug?
Right.
And we pull all of that information together and compare it with the preclinical information, and we sort of have a sense, well, this may work in patients with the disease. So then we design a study to determine how it works in patients with the disease. And we cannot just do that study. We have to then submit that information to the Food and Drug Administration. They look at the information that we've gathered, and they look at what we're proposing to do in patients, and they'll make a determination whether we're allowed to do that.
So you're interacting with the Food and Drug Administration throughout this process, and it's
very, very important.
Yes. Okay. Interesting. Could you talk a little bit about what types of non-clinical studies might be conducted during phase 2?
So, as we say, in clinical studies, we're studying what happens in patients, in humans. But at the same time, as we're moving along, we still have to conduct non-clinical studies, not in patients. For example, we want to understand what a longer-term exposure to the drug will do. So what we'll do is, the example with the heart cells, they were just given one dose of the drug,
Right.
and we sort of understand what happens. So we may expose those heart cells a lot longer, for a month, to this drug to see what happens, because we may want to study it for much longer in phase 2 in patients.
That to me just sounds fascinating. You've got a little dish of heart cells
Yes.
beating away there, and you're adding the drug. That sounds like kind of fascinating science, really.
It is really interesting actually to see. Sometimes we put a video camera on it, and we could watch it on a big screen, and you could see this heart cell moving back and forth.
Very fascinating stuff. And as far as the cost and time involved in phase 2, can you give us some idea of that?
So in phase 2, what we're doing is, again, studying in patients. Now, how long the study will take will depend on what kind of disease we're looking at. So, for example, if we're looking at patients, let's say we're looking at a drug to lower blood pressure.
Right.
So we give the drug, and we can observe within hours how it lowers blood pressure.
Right.
Or sometimes we want to see with time, does that maintain that lowering of blood pressure? If we're studying a drug for cancer, we certainly won't be able to observe the effects within a few days. We will have to take sometimes months to see whether a
Yes.
tumor or a cancer regresses or gets smaller. So it depends on what disease we're looking at.
Right.
But in general, just in general, what we're looking at is about at least 2 years. And the costs in there can be anywhere from $20 to $50 million.
Oh, that's a big
Yes.
expense.
Yes.
So going into phase 2 is really a key decision point for development of a drug, as far as spending the time and the money to take it into phase 2.
Absolutely. The considerations of the time, the money, and whether we think and the FDA thinks that it will work. We have to make sure we know that.
So you've been through phase 2 now. What comes next, and how do you interact with FDA at the end of phase 2?
So just in general, what we've done in phase 2 is we've studied in patients, and what we're doing there is we take patients that have the disease. So let's, and I'll use cardiovascular disease
Okay.
as an example. So we'll take a small number of patients, roughly 200 to 400 patients, and we will say, based on what we learned in phase 1, we may want to test 2 doses of the drug.
Okay.
So we test 2 doses of the drug, and what we're looking for is an effect on the heart. And this effect may take 2 to 3 months to develop.
All right.
So we stop at, say, 3 months, and we've gathered the data. Say we can look at heart size if you have congestive heart failure. And then we take that information, we say, okay, we understand something about which dose actually has an effect on, say, decreasing heart size
Right.
in congestive heart failure. We take that information, and we say, now, based on that information, we've made a decision. We think this drug will actually truly work in congestive heart failure, and we want to go into phase 3.
And you take this to FDA, this proposal.
And so we take the information to FDA, and we say, we want to go into phase 3.
So now we're coming close to the end of our phases, and what happens during phase 3 then? And again, the timelines, the patients, and so on.
So what we're trying to do in phase 3 is exactly what we did in phase 2, but at a much larger scale. So we've chosen the dose we think will work in the disease, and now we want to study it in a larger number of patients for a longer period of time to really understand, does this drug work, how long it takes to work, and is it safe?
And when you say a larger number of patients, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
So, for example, in heart disease, we could be talking about 2,000 to 5,000 patients.
Oh, that's,
Yes.
big groups.
Yes. And, for very serious diseases, we know that certain diseases, once you have that disease, your likelihood of survival, we understand how long you will survive. So we take that information, and so if we're studying a drug for cancer or for heart disease, we will follow it and see how much longer it will extend your life.
Okay.
So that's why some of these studies in very serious diseases take a long period of time.
How many phase 3 studies are done then, typically?
So usually 2 large phase 3 studies that will total, between 2,000 to 5,000 patients.
Okay.
It can take anywhere from, 2 years to 5 years to do these studies.
Mm-hmm.
And the cost can be anywhere from about $50 to $100 million to do that.
Oh, you're talking a lot more money now, aren't you?
Definitely.
So let's say your drug appears very safe and it has an effect on treating the disease. So at the end of phase 3, what happens to get product registration? What documents do you have to assemble? How do you interact with FDA? And how long does it take to actually get this product or this potential product onto the market?
So what we do is then we, as a company or a sponsor, will look at all the information we have gathered on this drug, and we'll make a decision whether we think that this is a drug that works and is safe to be put into for patients to have access to it. And if we make that decision, we gather all of the information and we send it to the Food and Drug Administration. They are required roughly to take about 10 months to review this information. Now, this is what we think as a company, that this drug is safe and it will work. So what the Food and Drug Administration usually does is they will gather at some point a panel of experts in this area. They will take the best medical doctors in, for example, in cancer, in a certain type of cancer, and they will have them review this information, and there will be a full day meeting to review all of the information and get into very detailed scientific medical discussions. And then that panel will have a vote on whether they think the drug should be approved or not.
So this is when occasionally on the radio we'll hear about FDA advisory committees, and this would be the advisory committee.
And these are very rigorous scientific medical discussions. And the company is there too, and we are able to answer questions.
Now, does FDA, do they need to take the final advice of the advisory committee, or do they make their own decision independent of the committee?
So the FDA takes, they take the considerations of the advisory panel, and they will take that and they will deliberate and determine whether they feel that this drug should be approved. One should recognize that at the same time, the FDA has knowledge and information of other drugs being developed by other companies, possibly for the same area, and they will weigh that appropriately. Oh,
that's interesting. So now that, let's say, you've been through the advisory committee, and if FDA decides, yes, we'd like to approve this drug, what happens next to actually get this on your pharmacist's shelf?
Okay. So once the drug is approved, then we as a company have to determine how quickly we can get it to patients. And one should remember, at this point, we were just testing the drug in patients. So now that it becomes a product that has to be available for doctors and for pharmacists, we have to create a label. We have to provide them all of this information. It comes sometimes in different types of packaging. It can be a pill, it can be a liquid, it can be what we call a pre-filled syringe, where the drug is actually in a needle already. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration before it's actually put on a pharmacist's shelf.
Okay, and this type then from the time period, let's say from the time you actually get an FDA approval out to the time it'll actually appear on the pharmacist's shelf is roughly what period?
So we as a company, when we know that especially that it's for a very serious disease, we try to get it within days.
Oh, that's interesting.
Days of approval to get it on a pharmacist's shelf, because there are a lot of people out there that need access to these drugs.
Yes, that's right. Certainly, you don't want to have to wait around while people are suffering.
Yes, that's right.
Let's say, in kind of to close things, as far as some general statements, can you give us an idea? I think we discussed this briefly, but as far as percentage of molecules that are identified as possible candidates for clinical development, and finally make it to the marketplace, can you put just a percentage figure on that? Perhaps give us some idea.
So, a lot of people know out there that the type of work that we do takes a long time, and the likelihood of drugs working and getting to the market is very low. So, just to give you a sense, that it's probably a 10% chance that once a drug has been put into that phase 1 study, that it will actually make it to the market.
So this is a high-risk business.
Yes, very, very, very high risk.
And typically, I know it depends on the clinical disease you want to treat and so on, but what would be a typical timeline from the time that you identify a drug to develop and the time that it is actually launched into the marketplace? So
it actually takes an incredibly long period of time, roughly about 10 to 12 years.
10 to 12 years.
And one should remember, why is it take so long, because it'd be great to have access to these drugs to patients a lot sooner. But some of the diseases we're looking at are chronic diseases. They last for a very long time, cancer, heart disease. So we need to be able to study them for a long period of time to know whether they work and they're safe over a long period of time.
And as far as a typical cost from that identification of a lead molecule to the time of product launch, I know again it does vary on the indication, but what would be a typical representative cost for all this work?
So this is a staggering number, actually, but right now we are looking at it probably costs over $1 billion.
$1 billion?
Over $1 billion.
In closing, Raj, do you have any final comments that you would like to make about drug development and working in the business of this?
So, Charles, the past few minutes we've talked a lot about the process of drug development. We've talked how much time it takes.
Yes.
We talked about some very serious diseases. We've talked about some costs, as we end off with that $1 billion number. But, one of the things, and the low likelihood of success, but, one of the most rewarding things for me personally and for a lot of us that work in this type of business is the fact that we're trying to find drugs to cure diseases, very serious diseases, and get those drugs to people. So that's what makes it very rewarding.
Well, Raj, I really enjoyed talking with you about the pharmaceutical development process, and thank you for coming and joining us on The Better Part. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Hope you enjoyed this program. If you have a topic for a program that you'd like discussed, or a person that you'd like to interview, you can reach us at the Cupertino Senior Center. Our phone number is 408-777-3150. Again, that's 408-777-3150. You can also learn more about us at our website, www.thebetterpart.com. On this site, you can also order a copy of this program, and copies of past programs are available at the Santa Clara County Library System. Thank you for watching, and see you at the same time, same station next week.